Hello and welcome to Full Contact Nerd. Thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Richard Hand and Jay McRoy, editors of Gothic Film and Edinburgh Companion, published by Oxford University Press, May 1st, 2020. Thank you both for speaking with me.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I guess I'll start with Richard. And then Jay, you can answer this. How did you get into studying and editing a book on this subject?
Well, I guess I've had a sort of academic interest for a long time in horror in the broadest sense, and Gothic is part of that, or perhaps horror is part of Gothic, I'm not sure. And over the years, I've published various things. I've published a lot on horror theatre and Gothic theatre, and even horror radio as well. And then many years ago, I met a guy called Jay McRoy at a conference, Popular Culture Association conference. Mm-hmm. And I think we were both on a horror panel. And,
I think so.
That's right, isn't it? Am I misremembering it?
I don't remember, but I think you're right.
And at that time, we were both interested in the place of adaptation in relation to horror. And so we kind of worked together, co-edited a book I think we're both very proud of, which is a collection of adaptation studies in relation to horror. Because what we found is in horror, often you've got the idea of transformation and transmutation, that kind of adaptation, but also as an industry, the kind of remakes and comic book to film and so on. And it was a really happy project that we worked on. And then more recently, the Gothic Studies group, part of the Edinburgh series, got in touch saying they want a book on film, and it was a great chance for Jay and I to collaborate again.
It was fun. It was great.
And let me just, as an aside, what sort of conference did you attend that had a horror panel? That sounds pretty cool.
It was one of the Popular Culture Association conventions, which they're quite something, aren't they, Jay? They're absolutely enormous, aren't they?
Huge. It was a Pop Culture Association, conference, and it was gigantic. Tons of panels.
Wow.
Tons of panels on horror. Tons of panels on, I think Buffy the Vampire Slayer was big at that time. Tons of panels on pop culture stuff.
Oh wow.
It was a great place.
Yeah, it's a great place, isn't it? Yeah, and because there's really niche stuff. I mean, whenever I go, I tend to go along to as many of the horror panels I can. But, sometimes you dip into really niche stuff like motorcycle studies and album cover studies. It's just great, And, sometimes an hour of that is enough, but it's great to see what's going on,
Mm-hmm. What city was that?
Where were we, Joe?
Was it in, there's one in Albuquerque, there was one in San Antonio.
Yeah, it was Albuquerque, wasn't it?
It was Albuquerque?
Yeah, Albuquerque, yeah.
And I asked because, I want to track this down and look more into it. And also I should add, I guess the book is published by Edinburgh University Press, and I guess Oxford University Press is associated, just to add that clarification.
Sure.
And Jay, so how did you get? I don't think you answered in detail how you got into this subject.
Oh, well, I'm sure. I'm thinking my history is fairly similar in some ways. I started off when I was very, very young, reading horror literature as a way of learning to read. Mm-hmm. It was one of the only ways that I would sit down for a prolonged period of time and actually have my face in a book. Mm. This is like when I was very, very young. And as I matured and went on to college and everything, it was always sort of in the back of my mind that horror and horror literature and horror film and that those topics would be topics that I would be pulled to again and again and again. And that's exactly what happened in graduate school. When I was doing my dissertation, I returned to horror, which I guess in some ways is like my first experience with reading critically or even reading for entertainment. And so it seemed fitting to come kind of full circle there. Mm-hmm. And then throughout my career, I've been writing on cinema, but largely on horror film. So it just seemed a natural progression.
Mm-hmm. And all right, so let's talk about the book then, and I'll read a bit of the description, and you guys can address this. Richard, you can start. So it says the book extends the field of Gothic film by spanning diverse historical periods, international contexts, and parentheses sub-genres. So Richard, I guess you can start by explaining what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, there's an approach to Gothic adaptation in terms of Gothic film where, you could just be looking at Jane Eyre adaptations or something, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But actually, we were very, very keen from the very beginning to really push this into the breadth that's there. And what's interesting, I think, with Gothic film, it's there from the very beginning. When people talk about sort of landmarks of early cinema, sure, yeah, we know it's D.W. Griffith, it's Buster Keaton or whatever, but actually the German expressionists and also mm-hmm. those early Universal pictures, the silent ones, it's really there. We've had 100 years of Gothic and horror film. So we wanted to look at that, but then also processes like adaptation and particularly as well that aspect of genre. So, we're quite proud of having chapters that are on Gothic sci-fi or the Gothic Western or whatever, because I think that's very real and it's very easy to ignore that. And I think some scholars would say, well, how can a Western be a Gothic film? But both Jay and I are very passionate to get scholars who really going to push that forward because, we think it's there.
And Jay, what's your take on this?
The way I kind of see the Gothic is, it's both a genre and a style. In some ways, it's similar to film noir in that way. And so you can approach, an adaptation of Jane Eyre, for instance, which already has Gothic elements in it, but you could approach it in a full-on Gothic way. I think it depends on the kind of visual and narrative style you deploy. Mm-hmm. So the Gothic is sort of is every bit as much of a category in which to group text as it is a stylistic trait or a collection of stylistic traits.
Mm-hmm. Now, before the call, Richard and I were talking about how Edinburgh likes to, for these kind of books, they like to pair up a European and a, I guess, non-European or American editor to give sort of a wider view of the topic. So as an American, what do you think, Jay, your perspective on Gothic film that you brought that might be different from non-Americans might be?
Wow. That's a really difficult question. The U.S. as a nation that was obviously very young history, but is one that and this is something that one of our contributors, Joe Benson, gets at in his chapter on westerns and horror, and Gothic in particular, that. There's a kind of history of bloodshed and violence that goes along with the settling of the United States as a nation, horrible violence. And so in many ways, I think there was a kind of, I guess, there's kind of a Gothic thread that runs throughout U.S. history. And so that's sort of, if I were to look at it that way, I would see the U.S. as a particular, or the settling of the nation as a particular kind of Gothic, and I use settling and all these other, colonialist terms in quotation marks. That's sort of the way I would see a difference. Is that just sort of that the history of the country is one that's imbued with the Gothic tradition in a way that I think is different from how Europe. Which has been imbued with the Gothic tradition for much longer is depicted. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it does. And Richard.
Oh, okay.
And Richard, your take as a European, what do you think about that question?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. I think, it's a terrific series that Edinburgh produced, but it's often dominated by perhaps a more European perspective, volumes like the Romantic Gothic, the Victorian Gothic, and so on. You know, and I think even though they have got, you know, a terrific collection on American Gothic cultures with terrific stuff, but I think, you know, that was really keen for that. Also, you know, when people talk about the Gothic, often they're approaching it in a literary way, literary studies way. And so I think when we had the chance to produce the book on Gothic film for them, I think, you know, really keen to cast that net as wide as possible. And that's why, yeah, we do have, you know, early American film, but German film as well, but right through to, you know, hardcore pornography and the Gothic.
Yes.
You know, that's a final chapter in the collection, Tom Watson's brilliant chapter. You know, and I think that was a real agenda for us, was that how far and deep can we push this, you know, to be really perhaps quite different to what people suppose Gothic studies is.
Yeah, and that's what I think is great about our volume, actually, Richard, is that it does have that expansiveness. Yeah, that's right. And like, you know, we got a terrific chapter on Dracula in Asian cinema, haven't we? And Andre's chapter, absolutely terrific. And again, you know, I think that's something when people are looking at Gothic studies, they may not look to Asian cultures. But we're trying to look at that, or Andrew does certainly, that interplay with something so core as Dracula, but how that's manifesting in Asia. Yes, that's a great chapter. Yeah.
I'm speaking with Richard Hand and Jay McRoy, editors of Gothic Film. You can find Richard Hand on his academic page at the University of East Anglia. You can find Jay McRoy at jmcroy.com. Please rate this podcast on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing my listenership. Please sign up for my book recommendation newsletter at crisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Please post your comments about this podcast or this episode on Facebook at Cris Alvarez FCN or on YouTube at Cris Alvarez. You can contact me directly on Twitter at Cris Alvarez FCN or on Instagram at Cris Alvarez Sci-Fi. If you're interested in other kinds of history, such as military history, or film, TV, books, and comic books history, including science fiction, fantasy, and horror themes, or the history of outer space exploration, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. And again, another topic Richard and I were discussing before the call, which is the amount of Gothic in Japanese anime. And we were just talking about how it seems that the Japanese have embraced these old, European Gothic and horror elements, to use them within anime, and now the anime, as it comes back to the US and Europe, it's almost like they're reinvigorating interest in those subjects in a way back in the US and Europe. Do you guys have any comments on that? No?
Yeah, Jay, you're the
my bailiwick. Okay, let me think. Well, the Gothic travels in interesting ways. And yeah, I think there's long been a sort of a history of borrowing different modes of representation. For instance, there's been a lot of history between say samurai film and the Western in the history of Japanese and U.S. cinema and their interactions between one another. And so I'm not surprised at all that the Gothic travels as well as it does. What I think is exciting is exactly what you were talking about, is the way in which that comes around full circle, and how Japanese anime and Japanese horror cinema, for instance, are able to sort of borrow from the Gothic, add their own kind of spin to it, and in a sense volley it back. Through distribution of these films and exhibition of these films, and of course then the influence goes towards the U.S. from Japan. So I mean I think it's a constant sort of cycle of borrowing and developing the genre further, and where I think particularly in this global culture, these cinemas begin to influence one another, it becomes sometimes, I think, a little bit difficult to say where one tradition or one style or one influence begins and another one ends at this particular stage at times.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. I'd also point out, alongside anime, the popularity of certain manga writers and graphic writing. I'm thinking of people like Junji Ito, who cites Edgar Allan Poe and H.P. Lovecraft as kind of core influences.
Mm-hmm.
But you're kind of getting that melding with traditional Japanese demons and folklore, producing a wonderful hybrid, as you say, that's sort of batted back and forth.
Yeah, and my students know Junji Ito way better than they know Edgar Allan Poe.
Wow.
They're far more familiar with Junji Ito.
Yeah.
And I think it has to do with the popularity of Ito's manga and the way in which it's been being adapted now kind of poorly, I think, into some animated features. But yeah, people love Junji Ito.
Yeah.
They love Gyo, they love Uzumaki. My students tend to dig it.
They do, yeah. They even have tattoos of it, don't they? Some of mine have.
Yes, they do. It's crazy.
Oh, wow. So, just to touch on Lovecraft a bit, since there's always been interest, or, there's been burgeoning interest, and now it seems like it's blowing up even more. How much is Lovecraft Gothic versus just like alien horror or monster horror or that sort of thing? How would it fit into what you discuss in this book? Either of you can answer that.
Well, I think Lovecraft, saw himself as in the tradition of Poe, even though later on he was quite disparaging about some of his most Poe-like stories when he got into his cosmic horrors, really. But so I think it's there, and I think there's an interesting quality, isn't there? I don't know what you think, Jay, but with this kind of Lovecraft-esque adaptations you get, I'm not saying necessarily the ones directly based on his fiction, but the ones that are tapping into that kind of Lovecraft horror world,
like The Lighthouse, or
exactly, yeah. And those madness, they end up being pure Gothic, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think there's much of a. I mean, obviously, the cosmic horror is dealing with sort of the unimaginable or that which exceeds the abilities even of language to describe it, especially in the short stories where it's like, oh my God, words cannot describe this horrible monstrosity I see in front of me, and then of course he goes on for a paragraph to describe it. Yeah, I think that there is a very, very, very close connection between them, and certainly in terms of his less cosmic stuff, I think it's more akin to what we would traditionally consider to be the Gothic, though I certainly think that his more cosmic Gothic stuff is more Cthulhu mythos and that sort of material. I think that he uses a lot of Gothic tropes, Gothic motifs in the storytelling, and so it's never too far away from traditional Gothic definitions.
So let me add a little additional question on that track. So I see a lot of stuff that's Lovecraft film-wise does seem to be Gothic, but do the movies that are based directly on his stories, do they use Gothic elements? Would they fall into this book too, or are those seem more horror and blood and monster type movies, the direct adaptations? Does that make sense? Any comments on that?
I mean, certainly, if you were to look at it in terms of, I guess the most conspicuous Gothic tropes, it connects, but in a very sort of, like, as you were mentioning, it's more monsters and creatures from other dimensions, and there's a kind of science fiction element to it. It's here I would say that the Gothic as a style is evident, but whether one would ultimately define Lovecraft as Gothic, I certainly think the argument can be made, although I can definitely see how it might not fit as comfortably within the Gothic genre as or within Gothic style as other films, say, the Woman in Black or something like that. That said, I mean, it's still, I think, I think the adaptations, whether they're by Brian Hughes or whoever, these adaptations of Lovecraft are, they still include Gothic elements, though I don't know necessarily whether I would say it's 100% a Gothic adaptation or a Gothic film. And of course, it depends on which Lovecraft we're talking about. And if we're talking about something like, say, a Lovecraft inflected film, something that's inspired by Lovecraft, I mean, I think there's a lot more Gothic elements that can be integrated into it. If we're staying close to it, I mean, there's something about the old New England settings with the old shuttered houses and sort of, crawling through it or making one's way through mysteries and making one's way through menacing or frightening locations. Not knowing is a huge element in Gothic narratives. The sort of discovery of something that was originally maybe beyond one's understanding. So I mean, I think that there is very much a Gothic strain that runs throughout H.P. Lovecraft. And like I said, I think you can make the argument both ways. I think you can make the argument that Lovecraft is, immersed in the Gothic and Gothic traditions, at the same time that you could say he pushes the Gothic maybe into new directions by including these cosmic elements.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And we have to point out, we don't say much about Lovecraft in the book, actually, do we?
Yeah, we don't. We don't have a Lovecraft chapter.
Okay, fair enough.
We don't have a romantic lit chapter either. I mean, there's so many more chapters we could add.
I know, yeah. We were spoiled for really putting it together, weren't we? For sure.
Yeah. It was. How are we gonna structure it? Where are we gonna put different essays? Yeah.
So with that thought in mind, what would each of you say are some of the prime examples of Gothic film that you talk about in the book? And that can be, and not necessarily, films that are great overall, but films that maybe for whatever reason really get at the core of Gothic film. And I guess, Richard, you can start by answering that.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose there's certain core things that have become very apparent. And actually, this is interesting for Jay and I. When we were talking to the series editors, they had expectations, I think, of the kind of thing they wanted to see, even though they were fantastic and let us get on with it and build our vision for the book. But, Dracula, Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, those are the kinds of things you expect to see. And that's something certainly in the book. The manifestation of those in different contexts, from, Mel Brooks comedy through to Asian horror films, mm-hmm. is really great. How those core stories, those kind of modern legends, modern myths, kind of bubble up to the surface in different ways, whether to terrify somebody or make someone laugh, So they're quite core. And then I think related to that, Stephen King's important, and this kind of later generations of writers. And certainly, we try and represent some of that. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly interesting, isn't it, Jay? Those kind of core stories, the Dracula, Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, they're recurrent, aren't they? Yeah,
absolutely. And the motif, the Jekyll and Hyde, the idea of having an alternative self or whatever. I mean, these they're more than just connected with Jekyll and Hyde. The Jekyll and Hyde motif is something that travels across a number of different narratives in different ways. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Would you say and this might sound, I hope this question doesn't sound dumb in any way, because Gothic is rooted sort of in a specific time period, but would you say it's the late 19th century authors who have pretty much laid all the groundwork for Gothic, and there really hasn't been others except maybe, Lovecraft in the early 20th century who've adjusted it? Or are there other more recent, like, have filmmakers added to the Gothic motif in any way beyond what the writers originally created for audiences? And I guess, Jay, you can start.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly I think the contribution, well, one of the major contribution comes from the significant difference between words on paper versus images and sound, and so the translation of words on words into image, I think, contains a kind of understanding of the Gothic that's going to be slightly different from what one would be adhering to in a literary text. So, for instance, let me give a better example. A haunted house or a bad place kind of motif, right? That often in Gothic narratives we have usually a female character sort of looking to escape, and translating written descriptions of fear, dread into visuals so that we can see it rather than have to be told it, I think it implies a certain kind of maybe not a different notion of the Gothic, but certainly a different way of articulating it, one that is purely visual, and so is going to necessarily exceed the limits of what a literal adaptation would do. There's that element of it that I think, they have to think about the Gothic in a visual way, as opposed to, I'm not saying you don't do that in literature, you do, but certainly in film, it's exclusively, image and obviously sound as well, but translating the Gothic into an image, I think is where we start to get some important differences in why Gothic film is, I think, important for us to look at. Again, I'm not sure if that answers the question or not.
Yeah, it does. It
does. Cool.
Richard?
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is the lens it can bring. And I'm thinking in the book, like Elaine Roth's chapter on Jordan Peele's Get Out, and actually Jay's chapter looking at Hitchcock. It's really exciting, I think, to look at some of those works that we may not immediately assume are Gothic, but through the lens of the Gothic, it's a real way of making sense of them, I think. It shines a light on them, and you look at them in a different way then. So yeah, that's what I'd add, yeah.
This is kind of not quite off-topic question, but a little bit of a tangent. Have you both seen the Sopranos series?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know it's not a film, it's a series, but I have this suspicion that some of the interest in it is, it feels, parts of it, a lot of it feels like like it has a Gothic feel to it. A lot of cold settings, a lot of dreary settings, and, just mental anguish and stuff, apart from the mob violence. Mm-hmm. Would you guys say that series had Gothic elements in any way?
Yeah, the character of Tony, he's sort of he's an interesting figure because he's both sort of a Gothic villain and a Gothic hero at the same time. He's an interesting character. He's violent. He's domineering. So he's monstrous in those senses, and yet he's very much anguished by his actions, anguished by the life that he's living, that he's surrounding. So in some ways, he's sort of put upon almost like a Gothic hero would be. I don't know, Richard, what do you think?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but as soon as you say that, yeah, you think of the mental anguish, as you say, and also the dark secrets,
Mm-hmm.
and Tony Soprano as kind of creator and destroyer. There is something Frankensteinian about him.
There is.
And the terrible things he does at times, which is Frankenstein trying to destroy the creature that he so lovingly created,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, that was just an aside. It's just something I've always wanted to explore about the series, so I just wanted your take on that.
Yeah, also, just following that up, you could say something about its use of suspense and structure, couldn't you? Because sometimes with Sopranos, you kind of, you're waiting for the next set piece of violence, or you're enjoying the kind of the conversationalism, the day-to-day stuff, but then there are going to be set pieces like that. There's a new series on, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but called Gangs of London, which does a similar thing. It's about the various factional gangs in London, gangster setup. And that's something with that, you're going to get 2 or 3 extremely violent sequences, revenge attacks or provocations. And in that way, that is like a Gothic tradition, you know, where you get your shilling shocker moment of terror, you know.
Yeah. The setup.
It's the blood pumping, you know.
Yeah. Which you see in Frankenstein, Dracula, and Jekyll and Hyde. You know it's coming.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I'm speaking with Richard Hand and Jay McRoy, editors of Gothic Film. You can find Richard Hand on his academic page at the University of East Anglia. You can find Jay McRoy at jmcroy.com. Please rate this podcast on whatever podcast feed you're listening to it on. These ratings go a long way in increasing my listenership. Please sign up for my book recommendation newsletter at crisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Please post your comments about this podcast or this episode on Facebook at Cris Alvarez FCN or on YouTube at Cris Alvarez. You can contact me directly on Twitter at Cris Alvarez FCN or on Instagram at Cris Alvarez Sci-Fi. If you're interested in other kinds of history, such as military history, or film, TV, books, and comic books history, including science fiction, fantasy, and horror themes, or the history of outer space exploration, you can find the links to my other podcasts and associated book lists at historyrabbithole.com. That's rabbit as in the animal. historyrabbithole.com. Thank you for your support. And now back to the podcast. So I was going to turn towards how you guys did your research, but are there would you like to point out any of the essays, anything we haven't touched on, issues that they talk about that you find particularly interesting? And Richard, you can start.
Yeah, well, you know, I think we're both really pleased with the range of things we've got, you know, and that income, as we were saying, that kind of historical timeline that people might expect. But I suppose that range again, and the way that, like, Jay looks at film noir in relation to Gothic is, you know, really refreshing look at that, because film noir is such a kind of well-embedded academic field of film studies, but actually this twist by looking at Gothic, I think, adds something very, very fresh. And also, you know, the way Adam Charles Hart looking at Hammer films. Again,
that's a good essay too, yeah.
It's a great essay, isn't it? It's something very well-worn and familiar. Of course, Hammer films is all about the Gothic and its place in British film history as a way of reviving the British film industry by going back to Gothic literature, you know. But actually, you know, Adam's particular take on it is really fascinating as the kind of phenomenon of new horror at that time. Great stuff, you know. I suppose other things, I mean, one other one I'd mention is Anna Powell looking at, you know, Jan Spankmeyer. So surrealist animation, and particularly his, you know, not particularly well-known sort of batch of Poe adaptations, you know. So it's great combination of things there.
And Jay?
Oh, he took my Anna Powell essay.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. Because that chapter on surrealism in the Gothic, I think, is one of my favorite chapters in the book. Yeah, in terms of, I mean, one of the things I'm most proud of with this volume is the array of voices that we have. I think, you know, obviously, you know, there's always new chapters. You're like, oh my God, we could add a Lovecraft chapter, but eventually you have to kind of rein it in at some point for the book to get published. But in terms of films and other chapters, I mean, that's we've hit on a number of them. I mean, there's I think one of the things it's great is we have chapters that are both historically based. Right, so we have a chapter, for instance, on early cinema and looking at examples of Gothic films that go back to, say, you know, Edison's Frankenstein, right? And we also have, you know, interesting sort of hybrids. Like we have a director like Park Chan-wook, who's a South Korean filmmaker who makes his first U.S. film in a film called Stoker. And it ends up being, in a sense, a kind of revisitation of things like Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt and Psycho. At the same time, he's very consciously deploying Western Gothic motifs from obviously from a cultural perspective that is non-Western, and so it's those are the kinds of things that I think that the volume offers that are really, really useful. Both that and the combination between sort of historical perspectives, but also analytical essays where it's breaking down specific shots and sequences in order to reveal the sort of the Gothic underpinnings.
Mm-hmm. I was just reading an essay on the movie Alien. One, does that count as a Gothic film? And two, whether or not it does, are there Gothic films in space that you could mention?
Well, we have got the chapter by Geraint D'Arcy that looks at Gothic science fiction, and Alien is pretty central to that. And it's a very persuasive essay. I think I think there's a tendency to think, well, science fiction couldn't be more different. It's an actually escape from the kind of cobwebs of the Gothic, but actually Geraint, I think, shows that how close the affinity really, really is.
Yeah.
And he starts by looking at sort of 1950s examples like The Thing from Another World, and of course it's pretty obviously Gothic, but then he does launch into some close studies of films like Alien, which are the language is all there, the semiotics and language of the Gothic is absolutely there, I think, but it's great to have a sustained exploration of that.
And Jay, do you have any additions?
I would advocate on behalf of Alien as a Gothic film for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It's ultimately a haunted house in space,
Yeah.
And so in some ways science fiction tends to take us away from the cobwebs. But one of the things I think is interesting about Alien is Alien brings the cobwebs with it.
Yeah.
Into space with them, and so when we have the alien in the ship. And of course, the entire ship is designed in a way that calls to mind the alien's own physiology, and so the alien becomes difficult to find, obviously, inside of this vessel, which is filled with shadows and dripping water and chains and tubing and hissing noises and all sorts of kind of these spooky elements. Right, the characters are constantly walking around in almost the dark, searching for this monster that's in this house and trying to get out at the same time, trying to avoid being destroyed by this creature. So I would say that Alien is for sure a science fiction film that deals very heavily in the Gothic, and I think it's another example of how the Gothic is a style that can be transported onto and transposed onto all sorts of genres. Right, so you can have Gothic sci-fi, Gothic westerns, Gothic romance, Gothic comedy.
One more thing about Alien there as well. It's interesting, this kind of place of performance, isn't it? Because looking at something like Alien, it's not that different to early classic Gothic films like Cat and the Canary, is it?
No, it's similar.
There's a creature in the house, and there's creaking corridors, and not much light. It's very recognizable, and that's interesting. I think that process of the time-based experience of watching a movie or a stage play, because Cat and the Canary was a huge stage play before they made the film version. But it is that unfurling, isn't it? And it's the thrill ride, gets the heart beating as the audience sits there watching.
Do either of you have an example of the strangest application of Gothic elements to a setting? I'll let either of you answer that if you have any ideas. Nothing jumps out at you as like, whoa, that was an odd mix.
Well, I tell you, I suppose it's one thing I touch on in my own chapter, if I may, is just that the place of kind of the Gothic in children's cinema and family-friendly stuff. So the example I give is the film version of Ready Player One, where in the novel, the 1980s movie that the characters have to live through is War Games. But in the film version, they change it to The Shining. And I couldn't believe it because I took my son to see it. And then suddenly I thought, my God, we were in the Overlook Hotel. And I thought, are they really going to take us through The Shining? And they kind of did. in a very ingenious way, actually, I must say. But so that really surprised me that they'd use that as a point of reference.
Yeah, that's interesting. Jay, do you have one?
Oh, I'm still thinking.
It can be like a Rorschach test, like the first thing that pops out in your head. It sounds like you're pretty amenable to Gothic in anything without question.
It's hard for me to. I mean, because whenever I see it, there's times when I'm, there's moments like, for instance, the example that Richard mentioned, where it's like, well, why is this here? But then, it kind of makes a kind of sense. I think that with, for me, I think I'm less surprised when I see the Gothic appear in places, because it seems that it's such a well-traveled style that I'm never really too surprised when it appears. There's moments. I think that the element of whenever I see it inside of a children's production, something specifically made for children, right, where suddenly there's this Gothic reference that I think are there not for the kids themselves, although I think obviously the kids see it and laugh or whatever, but I think are there for the parents and the adults who are in the same room as the children watching it on. Let me give you an example. SpongeBob SquarePants, right? Where you would expect the Gothic not to show up, or maybe to show up in a very coded way, right? There's this moment where they're all obviously they're all under the sea, whatever, in a pineapple, and they're inside this house, and the lights keep going on and off, right? And they're like, who's turning the lights on and off? And they look over, and it cuts to an image of Max Schreck from Nosferatu, standing next to a light switch on the wall, turning it on and off. Right? And they're like, Nosferatu. It's like, wah, 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 wah. Right? And it's like, well, wait a minute. What the hell was that about? Why was Nosferatu suddenly in SpongeBob SquarePants for about 20 seconds and then disappears? So there are moments like that where it's, especially in a children's piece, where you see something that is not just coded as the Gothic, but so specific to a very particular Gothic text and a very particular Gothic image. So there are moments like that.
That's right. Yeah, you made me think, Jay. The times like the music from Psycho shower scene is used in cartoons.
Or on Sesame Street as well, right? I watched an episode of Sesame Street where because Jay watches Sesame Street all day. But I remember seeing an episode of Sesame Street where they had a parody of Twin Peaks. And it was very, very creepy, and I was like, "What is this?" But
that is
the other
again. I don't know how much that's there for the children. I think that's there for the adults.
Yeah, keep them engaged. Yeah, but one thing also strikes me is this kind of Gothic structuring. You see it in documentary, don't you? Increasingly. I was thinking there's a fantastic documentary made a few years ago called Dreams of a Life, which is a true story about the young woman in London who died in a flat, but they didn't find a body for 7 years. They did.
I remember this.
Yeah, and
I remember this story.
And it's a shocking story, or a very sad story, but the film it's a documentary, and they talk to people who knew her and everything. But in a way, it's structured like a horror film. The way it unravels and reveals information. And they find a recording of the woman's voice when she did some demo singing. And the way that's presented, really quite eerie. It's like a spectral visitation. And all the time you're told it's true, the whole story. And it struck me that there's those examples of documentary that kind of do unfurl themselves like that, don't they? And even podcasts like Serial, it's a great Gothic narrative, isn't it?
Interesting. And it's sort of a side plug for this podcast. Since you mentioned SpongeBob, I actually interviewed in a previous episode Bob Kemp, who's now one of the producers for SpongeBob, and he's associated with, he was co-creator of the old Ren and Stimpy show.
Nice.
So, so just a little plug there. And I actually I want to double check and see if he ever talks about incorporating Gothic or creepy stuff in his work.
Yeah. Ren and Stimpy. That's well Gothic, isn't it?
Oh, for sure, and body horror on top of it, man.
Yeah.
Oh, so you guys you're serious about that? I thought.
No, I'm serious. There's Ren and Stimpy. I mean, you'll suddenly have a close up of a diseased mouth, or an abscessed tooth or something, and it's like, what the heck is this? And it's like pure body horror, like explodes out of this, comedy, which is often very over the top physical comedy in a cartoon animated form anyway. So, yeah.
There was that episode, wasn't there, where Ren got incarcerated in a cave like a good Poe character and built a kind of playmate out of his earwax or something. I mean,
oh my God, that's I don't know if I remember that episode, but that sounds like a perfect Ren and Stimpy episode.
So
yes, that sounds the earwax companion. That sounds perfect.
So there is a horror / Gothic element to these cartoons, subtle elements, I guess, in a sense.
Subtle, but they're there.
Yeah. Huh. So, kind of a cheap question for each of you, but if you had to give examples of your favorite, 1, 2, 3 favorite Gothic type films that you think people should see, Richard, you can start.
I guess. Actually, Jay mentioned one earlier, didn't he? The Lighthouse. I thought that was a fantastic achievement. That I really enjoyed that because it used very much old cinema techniques, but it was a wonderful modern Gothic story. Fantastic script, and the 2 central performances obviously magnificent. But I found that was the last film I saw at the cinema before lockdown, and it was a fitting one to see, I think. So something like that I felt was a real sort of reawakening of the genre. And other things, I mean, I kind of love films like Night of the Living Dead is a benchmark in sort of horror film, but it's also a terrific kind of social angst movie in the way that the Gothic does so well, and in that way, in the tradition of Jekyll and Hyde and Frankenstein, where something strange is happening to the human body. So I don't get tired of those old classics either. And one other one I'd flag up then as a third. I thought Jordan Peele's film Us was a terrific achievement. I think in some ways everyone was saying, not as good as Get Out, blah, blah, blah. But actually I thought as a picture of a society, as a whole society and the underworld of that, I thought it was a really fascinating modern Gothic vision, suitable for the, I was going to say Trump's America, but probably the Western world at the moment.
Interesting. And I'll add one add-on. Is there a Gothic film out there that people haven't seen, across over the 100 years that isn't well known that you think people should check out? Jay,
yes.
your favorite examples of Gothic.
Well, I really enjoyed both versions of the 2 versions of Nosferatu that I'm most familiar with, the F.W. Murnau, the original German expressionist silent film, but also the 1979 remake by Werner Herzog is particularly good. I just had an opportunity to rewatch it not that long ago, which is probably why it's at the top of my list at the moment. And I remember being just blown away by it. And so that would be an example. A woman walks home alone at night. I believe it's the title. It's an Iranian vampire film. That's a really, really, really great one. The Eyes of My Mother is another movie that I enjoyed recently. Again, a Gothic film that I don't think gets nearly the amount of attention that it should get.
Interesting. And Richard, did you come up with one that you'd like people to check out?
Well, I really like films like The Innkeepers, which I think I certainly found my students don't really know it, and yet they find quite an interesting affinity with it. I think Ty West films like House of the Devil were much more successful, but I think The Innkeepers is a little gem. It's beautifully filmed. The sound design is absolutely stunning. And the way it's filmed in a seedy hotel and everything. So, I'm always pleasantly surprised by movies like that.
So as you do this editing work, do you guys, do you watch everything that's referenced? How do you go about accessing these films and getting to them? Are they all readily accessible, or are there some that are very difficult to get your hands on?
Well, some of the case studies are really quite obscure, whether it's the Asian films or the hardcore pornography. So, but how we approach people who were experts in this field, and, we had some really fantastic kind of established names like Xavier Aldana Reyes, big name in Gothic studies, but we were also very keen on emerging scholars as well. But yeah, no, it's interesting. I found with every essay I was looking at, I was learning things, and I'd have a list of stuff that I'd want to pursue and watch.
And Jay?
Well, that's part of the pleasure of it is being turned on to or pointed towards essays that or films that are difficult to get to. I'm trying to think of which ones for me that I sought out. For instance, in the Western chapter, there were a number of Westerns, including classics like The Searchers, that I hadn't seen in almost a decade. Right. So I found myself revisiting films, particularly films that to go back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier, that you might not normally maybe associate with the Gothic right off the start. A movie like, for instance, The Searchers, where we have a character who has been kidnapped, let's put it that way, and the person's going to retrieve her. That one of the things that the essay on Gothic Westerns does is locate that particular narrative within a Gothic tradition, and so for me, I was like, well, I'm gonna have to watch The Searchers again, or I don't know how I'm going to. In order for me to get the most out of this essay, in order for me to be able to edit this essay, I need to rewatch certain films. So I found myself rewatching a lot of movies, and tracking down films, and of course, it's a lot easier now to find films than it used to be. Now, of course, there's so much stuff streaming and so many outlets for movies, including movies that are really hard to find. They have their own sort of web pages where you can find those films, things that are out of print, etc. So I think that the time that we live in right now is one where it's increasingly easy to get a hold of films that are hard to find, which is maybe something that this volume will do, is inspire people to seek out some of these movies that they may not have thought about or may not have seen in a long time or may not have seen ever, and to add those to their own sort of personal queue of films.
And you each might have already touched on this question, but I'll revisit it. Reading and editing these essays, what were each of you most surprised by that you discovered? And Richard, you can start.
Yeah, I think it's just that sheer breadth. I think, like in Andrean's essay on Dracula in Asian cinema, what a rich tradition it has in its own right, and it's not common knowledge in the West. I think there's a tendency to think we own Dracula, actually we don't, and that was really, really exciting. And similarly, I think that lens, like Jay talking about film noir, or Michael Coven talking about Italian Gothic cinema, it's absolutely so refreshing to get that perspective. So I think for me that was terrific.
And Jay?
Well, yeah, certainly the breadth is huge, but also I was constantly surprised by how well the essays work in relation to one another as well. I mean, yeah, they deal with often very, very, very different kinds of texts, but at the same time that they do that, there are a number of places where we'll have theoretical overlappings, or where similar texts will be written about from slightly different perspectives by 2 or 3 different writers. So, I mean, I think that I was always constantly surprised myself by the amount of times that there was really, I think, valuable overlap between different writers in the essays that they wrote.
As you did your editing work, each of you, how much did you have to go back, or do you do much of questioning conclusions, or say, oh, I think this needs more support? How much do you shape the essays?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, in some cases, we had some wonderful people were looking very broadly at screen, really, more than just film. So we did have some interesting television work, but then we had a guidance from the series editors that they really wanted it to be about film and cinema. So that was quite interesting for us, wasn't it, Jay? That it would have been really good looking at television Gothic, but that's another volume, I guess. Eventually,
that would be cool.
But certainly with some people, it was nice getting into a dialogue with some of them, and then others would just amaze you because they'd come up with these amazing essays, that this kind of area they've been working on. But it was nice, and we'd sort of take turns, wouldn't we, Jay? One of us would look at half of it, and then we'd swap over. And
I think it worked out really, really, really well, the way we divided up the work, and for sure.
Did you have any problems finishing the book? And I guess getting it published was pretty simple. The publisher came to you with the ideas, or did you propose it to them?
We were approached, and actually that was one of the longest phases, was developing the proposal, partly because of that kind of thing where they'd say, actually, we want less TV, or there's not enough on Dracula in the book. Can we have more looking at Dracula or whatever? So that there was a bit of back and forth with that, but obviously, the series editors have a vision for this incredible library they're building. But then they entrusted us, I think, handed it over, and we got on with the job. But it was interesting, and how we structured the book, we had a couple of versions of that, to say the least, didn't we, Joe?
We did, we had to we restructured it, I think, 3 times or 4 times.
So what's, for each of you, what's your next editing or writing project?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, right now I'm starting, I have a sabbatical next semester, and I'm looking to start writing on experimental film war. That's something that I've been much more interested in, particularly in relation to digital video and digital media. So that's sort of where my own research is heading at the moment. I don't have a particular volume that I'm working on right now, although I'm thinking about several different articles that I might be able to write over this sabbatical. I don't know, Richard, what are you up to?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, today I got a contract which is great, based on a proposal I put in, which is to write a book on the Innocents. The 19...
Oh, nice.
Yeah, 61 film based on Henry James' Turn of the Screw. Classic bit of British horror cinema, perhaps the great British horror film, maybe. And so I've got a commission to do that. So the book will come out next year to mark the 60th anniversary of the film.
Sweet.
So I'm thrilled to be working on that. So that's a nice one.
It's pretty cool.
And the other thing I'm doing is...
That is really cool, man.
Yeah. I'm also developing my interest in radio. So I'm developing a book on adaptation and radio, and the Gothic will be pretty central to that.
Nice.
So where can people find each of you on the web? Do you have web pages, social media, that sort of thing?
Well, for me, it's probably best if they look through the University of East Anglia in the UK. I've got a profile there, so they can email me or whatever if they're interested. I'd be delighted to talk things Gothic.
Okay. And Jay?
I can be found through the University of Wisconsin Parkside, but I also have a website, which is www.thejmcroy, just my name, TheJaymcroy.com. That's mostly where I put my stuff for teaching and that kind of thing for students. but it is a place where one can find me online. And obviously, you know, through the school, through my university email. And again, I'd be happy to hear from anyone as well. Sure.
Okay. That's all the questions I have. Do you, either of you have any final thoughts or words?
All I'd say is, you know, tell people to keep watching movies. It's a good time to be doing that. It has to be said. And, you know, and once you start looking for the Gothic, you can see it everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Suddenly it's everywhere. Yeah, it's true. It's true. And I want to thank you for having us on. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. It was really interesting conversation. Thank you both.
Yeah, but I would echo Richard's sentiments. You know, watch a lot of movies and
Yeah.
you know, and just be safe, I guess, at the moment.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. You can find more interesting information like this on chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. You can also find the podcast on your favorite podcast feed under the title Full Contact Nerd. That includes Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. Please remember to rate this podcast. It really helps. We're on Instagram at Cris Alvarez Sci-Fi, on YouTube under Cris Alvarez, on Facebook under Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, and on Twitter at Cris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd. Don't forget to sign up for my weekly newsletter where I recommend newly published books. The subscription box is on my webpage. Thanks for listening and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.